The trail switched back twice before the tree line broke, and she could see the homestead against the ridge. And Vara stopped there at the edge of the aspens and looked at it the way she looked at everything new, for the thing most likely to go wrong first. The cabin sat low and functional against the slope, timber-built, the roof sound from this distance. Barn to the east with a lean she could see even from 200 yards. The eastern foundation posts had heaved, or the crossbeam had settled, or both. Smokehouse. Root cellar door set into the hillside. Fence line running north along the pasture, and a man at the far post with a mallet and his back to her. She stood at the tree line and did the count she always did. 2 exits from the cabin that she could see, the front door and a window on the south wall. The barn would have a rear door. The root cellar was a problem. 1 entrance, no window, the kind of place a person could be put and not heard from. She filed that and moved on. The aspens behind her had gone full gold. First, hard frost had already taken them at the edges. The leaves gone translucent and trembling in the thin air, and the light through them was the color of old brass. She had 4 miles of that light behind her. 4 miles of trail from the point where Sen's man had set her trunk down in the mud and turned his horse around without a word, and her left shoulder had a bruise forming under the strap where the corner of the trunk had been riding for 2 hours. Temporary is all I've ever had, she thought. The shelter she was walking toward, the arrangement she had memorized the exit clauses of, the tolerance she expected to expire by midwinter, when the cold made a man's calculations about what he needed and what he could afford to be charitable about come out differently. She had read the contract 3 times on the road. She knew exactly what it said, and exactly what it did not say, and exactly which clause would let her walk away if the man at that fence line turned out to be the kind of trouble she had already survived once, and did not intend to survive again. She picked up the trunk and walked into the clearing. He heard her at 20 feet. She had been quiet. She was always quiet, her size notwithstanding. It was a thing she had learned young and kept. But the grass was dry and she was carrying 100 pounds of iron-strapped trunk, and there was a limit to quiet. He turned with the mallet still in his hand and went still. Not frightened. She registered that immediately. His feet did not shift. His hand did not tighten on the mallet. He just stopped and looked at her, and she watched him do it. The green-black skin first, the color of deep moss in shadow, her skin that went almost black in the direct mountain light. Then the tusks, then the trunk on her shoulder and the crooked fingers of her right hand wrapped around the strap. Then, last, her face. He looked at her face last. She had been standing in front of people for 26 years, and she could count on one hand, the broken one, the number of times a man had looked at her face last instead of first or not at all. She filed it. She did not decide what it meant yet. "You're earlier than I expected," he said. "Kansa, the road was faster than your broker told me." He nodded, set the mallet down against the post, picked up the tool bag at his feet and started toward the cabin. And she fell into step behind him because there was nothing else to do, and that was when he turned back and took the trunk from her shoulder. He did not ask. He did not say anything about it. His hands were already on the strap, and he had the weight transferred before she had fully processed the motion, and he carried it the last 20 feet to the cabin door and set it down on the step and opened the door, and that was the end of it. She stood for a moment with her left shoulder suddenly light and the bruise under it throbbing in the cold air, and she thought, he did that because his hands were free and hers had been carrying it for 2 miles. That was all. She did not make it mean more than that. Inside, the cabin was what she expected and nothing worse. 1 main room with a hearth, a table, 2 chairs, a sleeping loft above. The kitchen side was clean in the way that a person who lived alone kept things clean, not for company, just for function, because disorder in a small space cost time. There was a shelf of tools above the hearth that she catalogued without appearing to. Draw knife, spoke shave, 2 chisels, a gouge, carving tools, They had the look of things that were kept clean but not used, the blades oiled and the handles dustless in a way that suggested maintenance without purpose. The table was already set. 2 plates, 2 cups, a pot on the hearth that had been going for a while, the smell of it, salt pork and something rooted, a turnip maybe, filling the room in the particular way of something that had been tended and not rushed. She looked at the second plate for a moment, said nothing. "Supper's in an hour," Cale said. He had set her trunk inside the door. He was already moving toward the hearth to check the pot. "Loft's yours. There's a hook on the left wall for your coat." She looked at the loft ladder, looked at the hook, looked at the second plate again, already positioned across from the first, already waiting, and thought about the fact that he had set it before he knew when she would arrive, or whether she would arrive at all. She hung her coat on the hook. The hour passed in near silence. He stirred the pot. She sat in the chair that was not closest to the hearth. She ran warm, always had. And her blood ran warm the way orc blood did, and watched the room the way she watched all rooms, for the thing that would tell her what kind of place it was. The carving tools on the shelf, the single cup that had been sitting on the windowsill before he moved it to the table. The way he set the second plate down without looking at it, the motion so practiced it had gone below the level of intention. They ate. He did not ask her a single question. Not about the road, not about Sen, not about her hands, or her tusks, or the contract, or what she could do, or what she expected, or what she was willing. He passed the bread without comment, and refilled her cup without being asked, and ate his supper with the focused quiet of a man who had been eating alone for long enough that company did not require performance. She had braced for the questions. She had answers prepared, flat, factual, the kind that gave nothing away and closed doors politely. She had been ready for the inventory a man takes when he is deciding what he has acquired. None of it came. She sat across from a plate she hadn't set, at a table that had been waiting for someone before she was an hour down the mountain, and ate salt pork and turnip in the company of a man who seemed to require nothing from her at all. And somewhere between the first cup and the second she realized she had been braced for entirely the wrong kind of trouble. She did not relax, but she recalibrated. Outside, the aspens were losing their light. The ridge had gone dark against a sky the color of iron, and the cold was coming down off it in the particular way of mountain cold. Not wind, just weight. The air thickening and settling and meaning business. She had 4 months of that ahead of her, minimum. She had memorized the exit clauses. She picked up her cup and finished it and thought, temporary is all I've ever had, and this is no different, and she almost believed it. She was up before the light, not because she couldn't sleep. She had slept briefly, the hard, flat sleep of someone who had been walking for 2 days, but because the barn's eastern lean had been sitting in the back of her mind since she'd seen it from the trail, and the mind that notices structural problems does not stop noticing them just because the body is horizontal. She dressed in the dark, moving quietly out of habit, and went outside. The air hit her like cold water, but the aspens had gone still overnight, and the frost had come down off the ridge and settled on everything. The fence posts, the woodpile, the roof of the smokehouse, and her breath came out in a long white plume that disappeared into the grey pre-dawn. She stood on the cabin step for a moment and let her eyes adjust. The homestead arranged itself out of the dark in pieces. The goat pen, the root cellar door, the barn sitting slightly wrong against the tree line, its eastern wall pulling away from true by maybe 4 degrees, maybe 5. She walked toward it. The barn door hung on a single working hinge, the lower one, and she lifted it as she opened it so the drag wouldn't wake anyone. Inside smelled of hay and cold iron, and the particular animal warmth of the 2 goats Cale kept stalled through the night. She stood in the center of the floor and looked up. The lintel above the smokehouse door, she could see it through the barn's interior access, had cracked along the grain, a split running from the left mortise joint almost to center. Someone had wedged a piece of scrap timber under it at some point, a temporary fix, and the scrap had shifted. The crack had widened. She could see daylight through it in one spot, a thin, bright line that had no business being there. She put her hand on it, felt the give. Before February, she thought, maybe before December if the snowpack came in heavy. She was already running the calculation. Iron strap, 12-gauge minimum, 2 anchor points on either side of the joint, the load distribution across the door frame. When she heard him behind her, she did not startle. She had heard the cabin door. It'll come down," she said without turning. "The wedge has been walking left for at least one winter. You can see where it was originally from the compression mark." Cale said nothing. She turned and found him standing in the barn doorway, with his coat half buttoned and his right hand wrapped in the linen strip she had seen him reach for yesterday morning, the one he kept on the shelf above the wash basin. He was looking at the lintel, not at her. "Smokehouse'll be unusable," she said. "Door won't hang true once the frame shifts. You'll lose the seal." He looked at the crack. He looked at the wedge. He looked at the compression mark she had pointed to, the ghost of where the wedge had started. "It's iron stock," he said. "Back of the barn." She had already found it. She had found it in the first 10 minutes, with the way she found everything. Not by searching, but by looking, which were different things. A good length of flat bar stock, heavier gauge than she needed, which was better than lighter. She could work it down. He lit the forge himself. She had not asked him to. He banked the coals from last night's fire and worked the bellows with his left hand, favoring it, and she watched the angle of his right wrist and understood the limitation without being told. She adjusted the placement of the stock in the fire accordingly, closer to the near side, so she could draw it and work it without passing it across the full width of the anvil. He would not have to grip at extension. He did not acknowledge the adjustment. She did not explain it. They worked without much talking. Well, she drew the iron and set the first bend, and he held the stock steady with the tongs while she struck, and the hammer rang off the anvil in the cold morning air, and the goats shifted in their stall, and the light came up slowly through the barn's single east-facing window, and her hands did what they had always known how to do. The crooked fingers on her right hand were stiff in the cold. They were always stiff in the cold, and she worked through it the way she always worked through it, which was to keep moving, keep the metal moving, keep the heat in the iron and the iron in her hands. The dark jade of her skin was dusted with forge scale by the second hour, fine black flecks across her knuckles and forearms, and she did not notice because she was not thinking about her hands. She was thinking about the load path, and the way force traveled through a frame, where it wanted to go and what you built to redirect it. By midday, the brace was done. She set it herself, Cale holding the frame steady while she drove the anchor bolts, and when she stepped back, the lintel sat true for the first time in what looked like 2 winters, maybe 3. The crack was bridged, the load was distributed, the door hung level. She tested it 3 times. It held. Cale looked at it for a long moment. Then he looked at her, not at her hands, not at her tusks, not at the forge scale on her forearms, just at her face, the way he had at the fence line yesterday, the way that still sat slightly wrong in her chest because she did not have a category for it yet. "That's better work than I could have done," he said. "Or not good work. Not thank you. Not the performance of a man who wanted her to feel welcome or useful or settled. Just the plain accounting of a fact, stated in the same tone he used for everything, which was the tone of a man who did not see the point of saying things he did not mean." She stood there with the hammer still in her hand and did not know what to do with it. She had been assessed before. She had been appraised, evaluated, documented, contracted. She had been told what she was worth in numbers and in terms and in clauses. She had not been told plainly by someone who had watched her work and had nothing to gain from the telling, that the work was good. She turned back to the forge and began banking the coals. The fence posts on the north line need resetting, she said. 3 of them have heaved. I can do it before the ground freezes hard. All right, he said. She heard him go back inside. A few minutes later, she smelled coffee. When she came in from the barn, there was a cup on the table at her usual place, still steaming. He was already at the window with his own, looking out at the tree line, his back to her, his wrapped hand loose around the mug. She sat down. She drank the coffee while it was hot. Outside, the aspens stood golden still in the afternoon light, and the smokehouse door hung true. And she thought, good work lasts. She did not say it. She was aware, in some part of herself, that she did not examine directly, that it was the opposite of what she usually told herself. She let the thought sit there without doing anything about it. The coffee was strong. He had made it the way she had made it yesterday morning, which meant he had noticed how she made it. She did not know what to do with that either. The routine had started before she left Sen's road camp. 7 repetitions, each finger in sequence, the right hand last because the right hand was the one that needed it most. Flex, hold, release. The 2 crooked fingers resisted at the middle joint the way they always did. A dull, specific resistance, not quite pain, more like a door that had been rehung wrong and would never quite close flush. She had learned to work around it. She had learned to work around most things. The kitchen table was good for this. Solid, flat, the right height. She spread her hand against the wood and pressed down gently and held it. Outside, the dark had come down early. October was doing what October did at this elevation, arriving ahead of schedule, making itself at home without asking. The fire in the hearth had burned to a steady low, and she had not added to it because she did not want to get up and interrupt the count. She heard the door before she saw him. Cale came in from the trapline with cold still on his coat and stopped just inside the threshold, and she did not move her hands. He looked at them. Not the way Sen's man had looked, measuring what they were worth or what they cost him. Just looked, the way a person looks at something they are trying to understand without asking the wrong question. He hung his coat. He came to the table and sat down across from her and said nothing for long enough that the fire settled once and the sound of it filled the room and then went quiet. Does it hurt? Not what happened. Not who did that. Just the one question. They aimed at the present tense, at the thing that was real right now in this kitchen. Her hand stayed flat on the table. In cold weather, yes. She finished the repetition on the left hand before she continued. I manage it. He nodded. He did not say I'm sorry or that must be difficult or any of the other things people said when they wanted to close a subject they'd accidentally opened. He just sat there, and the silence was the kind that did not require filling. She looked at her right hand. The 2 fingers, the way they angled slightly inward at rest, the way the skin over the knuckles had gone a shade darker than the rest of her, that deep jade going almost black at the joints, the color her skin went when it had been under pressure for a long time. She knew the story written there. She had stopped expecting other people to read it correctly. There was a man on the road north, she said. A Sen's man. I told him the terms were wrong, that the contract my mother signed had a clause about renegotiation, and I wanted to use it. She paused. Kiwi disagreed. Cale's hands were on the table too, and she noticed, not for the first time, that he had wrapped the right one before coming in, the way he did in the mornings, the tendon damaged one. He never mentioned it. She had adjusted the forge work accordingly, and neither of them had discussed the adjustment. He broke them himself, Cale said. He had help. She said it without affect, flat, factual, the voice she used when the thing being described was too large to carry any other way. 2 of them. They were efficient about it. The fire made a sound. Outside, there's something moved in the pines. Wind or an animal, or just the mountain settling into its cold. I set them myself, she said. The bones, I knew how they needed to sit. She flexed the right hand once more, slow. They didn't sit exactly right, but close enough to work. Cale said nothing. He was watching her hands, not her face, and she found she did not mind this. Her hands were the honest part. They had always told the truth about what had happened to her, and she had long since stopped trying to make them tell a different story. "My mother signed the contract," she said. "Not under duress, not without understanding what it was." She heard herself say it and waited for the familiar tightening in her chest, the one that came when she let herself think about it directly. It came. She breathed through it. "She chose me, not my brother Dav, me, because I was the one who could survive it." She had said this before, in her own head, many times. Said it to the road, to the trailhead, to the 2 miles of switchback she had walked alone with a trunk on her shoulder. She had not said it aloud to another person. "Temporary is all I've ever had," she said. "I knew how to leave. I didn't know how to stay and make her choose differently." The words sat in the room. Cale did not move to pick them up, did not offer a counter-argument or a consolation or a reframing. He let them sit where she had put them, which was the only correct thing to do with them. After a while he said, "Where your mother was wrong. Not I understand. Or she must have had reasons, or perhaps she thought she was protecting you. Just the verdict plain. Be delivered the way he delivered everything, with the minimum number of words that constituted the truth." Vara looked at him. His face was the same as it always was, weathered, still, not giving much away. But he had said it, and he had meant it, and she did not argue. She did not argue because she had been arguing with herself about it for 2 years, and she was tired, and because the word wrong, just that word, unqualified, was the first time anyone had handed her a verdict that did not require her to also defend her mother or explain the clan's debt or account for the logic of being the one who could survive it. She looked back at her hands. He got up. She heard him at the hearth, and then the soft sound of cloth on stone, and then he set something beside her right hand on the table, a piece of hearthstone, the flat kind, it wrapped in a piece of old flannel, still warm from the fire. He did not say what it was for. He did not say anything. He went back to his side of the table and sat down again. She did not thank him. She put her right hand over the wrapped stone and felt the warmth move into the joint and held it there. Outside the window, the cold had come down off the ridge in earnest. She could see the way the pines had gone still, the particular stillness that came just before temperature dropped hard, the mountain pulling everything close before it turned. The hearthstone was warm against her palm. The 2 crooked fingers lay flat against the flannel and did not resist. She thought, "This is the longest I have sat still with another person, without waiting for the thing that ends it." She did not say this. She kept her hand on the stone and let the warmth do its work, and neither of them moved, and the fire burned low between them, and the cold pressed at the glass, and the room held. The squash count was 43. Vara had written it in the ledger in 2 columns, variety on the left, estimated weight on the right, and then added a 3rd column for projected spoilage rate based on the cellar's temperature and the gap under the east-facing door that let in more cold than it should. She had not been asked to do this. She had done it because the numbers were there, and incomplete numbers bothered her in a way she could not fully explain, and had stopped trying to. Cale was at the stove when she came in from the root cellar, his back to her, Amma doing something with the iron pot that involved a long wooden spoon, and the particular patience of someone who had cooked alone for a long time. The cabin smelled of onion and something smoky, and the faint mineral edge that always came off the hearthstone when it had been burning for hours. Outside, the last of the afternoon light was going grey at the window. October had arrived without ceremony. She set the ledger on the table and read the squash count aloud. He turned enough to hear her, not enough to stop what he was doing. She read the spoilage column too, and the projected loss if the cellar door gap wasn't addressed before the hard freeze. How big a gap, Dee? He said. 2 fingers at the bottom. Maybe 3. He was quiet for a moment. I'll pack it tomorrow. She nodded and sat down. He had already set the table. Both plates, the way he always did, the second one across from the first, and she had stopped noticing it in the way you stop noticing a thing that has become part of the room. What she noticed instead was that he had set her cup on the correct side without looking, the way you do for someone whose habits you have learned without meaning to. She opened the ledger to the next page and began the calculation she had been turning over since the morning. The load estimate for the barn's north wall if they added a second hayloft before winter. Her fingers moved across the page, the crooked ones on her right hand doing the work they always did, slower than the left, more deliberate. The cold had come down off the ridge that afternoon and she could feel it in the joints, the specific deep ache that she had learned to work through rather than around. She flexed them once, twice, and kept writing. Cale put a bowl down in front of her without announcement, then his own. Then he sat, and they ate. And for a while the only sounds were the fire and the wind finding the corners of the cabin and the occasional shift of the pot on the stove. She had been thinking about the second plate for 3 days. Not obsessively. Just the way you think about a thing that doesn't fit the category you put it in. She had filed it under habit when she first arrived, which was the correct category for a man who had been alone long enough to calcify his routines. But habit didn't account for the cup on the correct side. Habit didn't account for the way he had started leaving the ledger ink on the table instead of putting it back on the shelf, because she used it every evening and he had noticed. But she looked at the plate in front of her and then at the one across from her and said, "Urchat, the second plate. How long?" He didn't go still the way some men did when you asked them something they hadn't offered. He just looked at the table for a moment and then said, 3 years. Emperor. Since your wife. Aunt since Maren. He said the name the way you say a word you have said 10,000 times. Worn smooth, the edges gone, but the shape still there. She had heard about the fever winter from Nessa briefly at the bottom of the mountain. She had not asked. She asked now, because the silence in the cabin was the kind that had room in it. There was a child. 4 days. He picked up his spoon. Never named him. Vara looked at the window. The dark was full now, the glass giving back only the interior of the room, the fire, the table, the two of them. She did the arithmetic without deciding to. She always did the arithmetic. He would have been 3 this winter, she said. 3 years, 2 months, roughly. Cale set his spoon down. He looked at the window for a long time. 3 years, 2 months, and about a week, he said. She went very still. Not because it was unexpected exactly, but because it was the precise opposite of what a man who had closed a door did. A man who had closed a door rounded down. He said 3 years and moved on. He did not say 2 months and about a week. He did not say it the way you say something you have counted every morning, quietly, before the day began, because the counting was the only ceremony left. She did not say anything. There was nothing to say that would not make it smaller. After a while he picked up his spoon again and finished eating, and she finished eating, and when the meal was done, she carried both plates to the basin and washed them, the way she had started doing without it being assigned. The water was cold. She had not heated it, and her right hand ached in the way it always did at the end of a cold day, but she washed both plates and set them back in the cupboard, side by side, and dried her hands on the cloth by the window. She could feel him in the doorway behind her. Not watching her. Exactly. Just present. The way he was present in a room. Not filling it, not demanding anything from it. Just occupying his portion of it with a steadiness she had not yet found a category for. She turned around and he was already moving back toward the fire, and she went to the table and opened the ledger again. Written, and they spent the rest of the evening in the same room without needing to account for it. She did not think about the plate again until she was in her bunk, the cabin gone dark and quiet around her. the wind working at the roof in the way it had been doing since the cold came down. She thought about the counting. 2 months and about a week. She thought about what it meant to carry a number that precise for 3 years without putting it down. She had her own numbers. She knew what that was. She stared at the ceiling and thought about the word temporary, which she had said aloud 3 nights ago in the kitchen, and which had not, she realized, felt entirely true even as she was saying it. She had said it because it was the word she had always used. She had said it because it was the word that kept her from expecting anything she would have to grieve when it ended. She was not sure, lying there in the dark, that she had said it correctly. Outside, the wind moved through the pines. The fire had banked itself down to coals. Somewhere in the cabin, on the other side of the wall, a man was lying in his own bunk, counting days he had never stopped counting, and she thought that she had been bracing for the wrong kind of trouble on this mountain from the very beginning. And she was not yet sure what the right kind was, only that it was quieter than she expected, and it did not announce itself, and it set your cup on the correct side without looking. The horse came up the switchback at a pace that said the rider knew the trail. Warvara heard it before she saw it. The particular rhythm of a well-shod animal on loose shale, unhurried, picking its footing with the confidence of a horse that gets fed regularly and worked rarely. She was at the forge when the sound registered. She set down the drawer tongs and did not pick them up again. She came to the barn door and watched. The man who rode into the yard was perhaps 50, perhaps less. It was hard to say with men who had spent their lives indoors. His coat was charcoal wool, cut well, with brass buttons that had not been replaced when they wore out, but had been kept polished instead. His horse was a grey with clean legs. He had a leather satchel across his saddle that sat flat and organized, the kind of satchel that held documents rather than tools. His expression, when he saw her standing in the barn doorway, did not change. That was the first thing she catalogued. Most men's expressions changed. Cale was splitting wood at the far end of the yard. He heard the horse too, and came around the corner of the cabin with the axe still in his right hand. Not raised, just present. The man in the good coat dismounted without being invited. He tied his horse to the fence post nearest the gate, not the one Cale had replaced in September, the older one, asked which held better, and walked toward Cale with his hand already extended. "Kew, Dunmore," he said. "Aldrich Sen. I believe we've corresponded." Cale shook the hand. One pump, dropped it. Vara stayed in the barn doorway. She counted the distance between herself and the cabin. 14 feet. Between herself and the horse, 8. She noted that Sen's satchel was buckled, not clasped, which meant it opened faster. She noted that his boots were clean, which meant he had not walked far this morning, which meant he had ridden from somewhere he slept last night, which meant he had planned this visit from a distance. She had known he would come. She had thought she had 3 more weeks. Sen turned toward her. His expression was still pleasant. It was the pleasantness of a man who had learned that pleasantness costs nothing and buys time. And you must be Vara," he said. "I've heard good things about your work on the smokehouse." She did not answer. She watched his hands. The left one held his lapel loosely. The right one was empty and relaxed. He was not nervous. Men who were nervous moved their hands differently. "I won't take much of your time," Sen said, and turned back to Cale, which was the thing she had been waiting for him to do. He always talked to the man. She had watched him do it twice before, in different yards, with different women standing in different doorways. He talked to the man because the man held the contract, and the woman was the contract, and there was a particular efficiency to that arrangement that Sen had long since stopped examining. He opened the satchel. He produced a document with a magistrate's seal in red wax at the bottom, and the kind of seal that cost money to obtain, and was obtained specifically so that it could be shown to people who did not know what it did and did not do. "And there's a clause in your original agreement," Sen said, "as that provides for renegotiation of terms at 60 days. We're coming up on that window. I wanted to make the courtesy visit in person rather than by post." He smiled. A mountain mail, being what it is. Cale took the document. He read it. He read it the way he did everything, without expression, without hurry, without performing the act of reading for anyone watching. His right hand held the page, and his left hand hung at his side, and Vara could see from the barn doorway the faint tremor in that left hand that came when the cold got into the damaged tendon, the one he wrapped every morning before he started work. He had not wrapped it yet today. He had been splitting wood when Sen arrived, and the morning was not warm. She watched Sen watch Cale read. Sen's eyes moved once, back to her. He held her gaze for 2 seconds and then looked away, and in those 2 seconds she read everything she needed to read. He was not afraid of her. He was not threatened by her. He was simply noting her position the way you noted the position of a thing you expected to collect later. Cale closed the document. He set it on the fence post beside him, not handing it back. "Renegotiate to what terms?" he said. "That would be the conversation," Sen said pleasantly. "At the 60-day mark, I'm simply here to confirm you received proper notice in person, as the contract requires." Cale looked at him for a moment. Then he looked at the sky to the west, where the cloud cover was coming in off the ridge in the particular way it did before the temperature dropped. "Trail ice is early this year," he said. "You'll want to be off the mountain before dark." It was not a threat. It was delivered in the same register he used to say that the root cellar needed another cord of wood before November, or that the east fence would need resetting in spring. It was a fact about the mountain. The mountain did not care about Sen's coat, or his seal, or his pleasant expression, and Cale was simply passing that information along as a courtesy. Sen smiled. He took the document back from the fence post, folded it, returned it to the satchel. He untied his horse. He mounted without difficulty and turned the grey toward the gate, and as he passed the barn he looked at Vara one more time. "Ma, good afternoon," he said. She said nothing. She watched him ride down the switchback until the trees took him, and then she watched the trees for another minute after that, because the trees would tell her if he stopped. He did not stop. Cale came to stand beside her, not close, just near enough that she could see him in her peripheral vision without turning her head. He had the axe in his right hand still, the handle loose in his grip, and he was looking at the same tree line she was looking at. After a while he went inside. She heard him at the table. Then he came back to the barn door and set the contract down on the workbench beside her drawer tongs. Their copy, the one he kept in the tin box on the shelf above the hearth. He had not gone to the shelf for it since she arrived. "You should read the whole thing again," he said, "but both of us should know what he thinks he has." He went back to the woodpile. She heard the axe. Vara pulled the contract toward her and opened it on the workbench beside her ledger. The forge was still hot at her back. Her dark jade hands, the left one steady, the right one with its crooked fingers that knew how to work despite themselves, smoothed the pages, flat. She read. The renewal clause was on page 4. It was written in the compressed legal language of a man who had drafted many such clauses and knew exactly which words to make visible and which to let sit quietly in subordinate phrases. She read it once for meaning and once for structure, and the third time she read it she found the word "sen" had not said aloud. Mutual. Renegotiation required mutual agreement of both parties. Not unilateral, not at Sen's discretion. Both, or as she read it a fourth time to be certain. Outside, the axe came down in its steady rhythm. The cold was coming in off the ridge now, the kind of cold that arrived before snow, and somewhere down the switchback a man in a good coat was riding south on a well-fed horse, patient as paperwork, counting on her to be gone before the 60 days were up. She was not calculating her exit. She pulled her ledger open to a clean page and began to write. The two contracts lay side by side on the table. Vara had weighted the corners with the salt crock and the lamp base so they wouldn't curl, and she had drawn a single line in pencil down the margin of Sen's copy, wherever his language diverged from the original filing she'd pulled from memory. There were 11 lines. She had checked them twice. Cale stood at the other end of the table with his coffee going cold in his hand, reading. She waited. The lamp threw yellow light across the page and across the dark jade of her forearms, where she'd pushed her sleeves up, and she watched his eyes move down the clause in question, the renewal option, paragraph 4, subsection C, and stop. Mutual, he said. Mutual renegotiation. Both parties must agree to open the terms. Sen's summary says either party may initiate. That's not the same sentence. Cale set his coffee down. He read it again. She watched him read it and kept her face where she put it, which was nowhere in particular, which was what she did when she was not sure yet what a person's hesitation meant. He said, I should have read the whole thing." She had been ready for doubt. She had built her argument for doubt. It had the margin notes and the parallel columns and the specific citation from the settlement code that governed frontier labor contracts in the Greymount jurisdiction. She had not been ready for that. "Yes," she said. "I signed it 8 months ago." He put the paper down. I read the summary. Sen's man was at the ford for one afternoon, and I had a trap line to set before the cold came in, and He stopped. I signed it without reading it. She understood then what his face was doing. It was not doubt. It was the specific expression of a man who has done something careless and is holding the weight of what that carelessness cost someone else. She had seen that expression before, on other faces, and it had always preceded an argument about why the carelessness was not, in the end, his fault. She waited to see what he would do with it. "You are a thing I acquired carelessly," he said. She went flat. The warmth that had been building in her chest over 3 weeks of mornings and forge work and evenings with the ledger open between them went flat and practical, and she heard herself say, "That's an accurate description of the contract, yes." That's not." Put both hands on the table. The right one, the tendon-damaged one, he'd wrapped that morning before the bellows work, and the cloth wrapping was still on, slightly loose now at the wrist. "That's not what I meant to say." "What did you mean to say?" He was quiet for a moment. Outside, the wind had come up off the ridge and was working at the corner of the smokehouse, the low sound it made when the temperature was dropping fast. "And I meant that I am ashamed of what I did without thinking," he said, "and that you are the one who has been living with the consequences of it." She looked at him. The lamp moved slightly in the draft from the window, and the light shifted across his face, and she filed what she saw there, which was not performance and was not apology in the soft, useless sense, and was not a man explaining why she should feel differently than she did. She said, "Which the clause still holds, regardless of how it was signed." "I know it does." "And then we have a legal position." "Keek, I know that too." They stood on opposite sides of the table, and the 2 contracts lay between them, and neither of them moved for a moment. And then hoofbeats came up the trail from the south. Not Sen's easy pace, something faster, and Cale went to the window. Nessa Calvert came off her horse before it had fully stopped, which was not how Nessa Calvert usually did anything. She was a woman who moved at the speed of someone who had decided long ago that urgency was mostly theater, and the fact that she was moving quickly now meant something. Cale had the door open before she knocked. She came in with her coat still buttoned and a leather document case under her arm and looked at Vara first, directly, the way she always did. "You must be further along than I thought," she said, nodding at the 2 contracts on the table. Cale's letters about the smokehouse repair were very complimentary, by the way. He used the word precise twice. He doesn't use words twice. Vara looked at Cale. He was looking at the window. But Nessa set the document case on the table and opened it and took out a folded paper with a filing stamp across the top. "Original registration. Sen filed it with the settlement office at Dunwick's Ford 8 months ago, same day Cale signed. I pulled it the morning after Sen's visit. She paused. Cale rode down before first light, asked me to find it. Vara was still looking at Kyle. He had not told her he'd done that. He had let her spend 2 days building the counter-argument from memory and margin notes and her own careful reading. And he had already ridden down the mountain the morning after Sen left and asked Nessa to pull the original filing, and he had not said a word about it. She did not know what to do with that for a moment. She put it somewhere and came back to the document. The mutual clause was there, in the original. In plain language, unambiguous, exactly as she had reconstructed it. Sen's copy had not altered the contract. It had summarized it selectively, in a way that made the mutual requirement invisible. That's not an error, Vara said. No, Joey, Nessa agreed. It is not. Cale picked up Sen's copy and read the summary language one more time and set it back down. He did not say anything about what it meant that a man had ridden to his homestead with a selectively summarized document and a magistrate's seal and a pleasant expression. He didn't need to. Nessa stayed for an hour. She drank the coffee Cale reheated without being asked to stay, and she walked Vara through the settlement code citation that would support the mutual clause argument before the magistrate, and she said, before she left, that she could witness the original filing if it came to a formal hearing. After she rode out, the cabin was quiet again. The wind had settled. The lamp had burned lower. Vara sat down across from the two contracts and opened her ledger to a clean page and began writing the argument in numbered form. Cale cleared the coffee cups and came back to the table and stood there for a moment. And then he sat down across from her and said, "Tell me what you need to fight this." She looked up. The lamp was between them, and the light caught the green-black of her hands where they rested on the page. Her crooked right fingers curved around the pencil, and she looked at him for a long moment and thought about what it meant that he had ridden down the mountain before she'd finished her first cup of coffee, the morning after Sen's visit, and had not said so, and had let her work. "I need you to mean that," she said. "I know," he said. She looked at him one more moment. Then she turned back to the page and wrote the first number and began. The letter came with the morning supply rider, tucked between a hardware invoice and a seed catalogue, and Vara knew Dav's handwriting before she finished pulling it from the bundle. She stood at the cabin door and read it twice, then a third time. Her mother was ill. The clan wanted her back. Dav had written it carefully, the way he wrote everything. Each word chosen, nothing wasted. And the love in it was real. She could feel that. The way you can feel the shape of a hand through a glove. He missed her. He said so. He said their mother asked for her by name. She folded the letter and went inside and stood in the middle of the room for a moment, not moving. Then she pulled her trunk out from under the bed. The body knew before the mind finished arguing. That was the thing about old reflexes. They didn't wait for permission. Her hands were already moving, the crooked fingers on her right hand working the latch without difficulty, the way they always did when the task was simple enough not to require full grip. She had packed this trunk in worse conditions than this. She had packed it in the dark, in rain, once with a split lip and the particular clarity that comes from pain. The body remembered all of it. The body said, "You know how to do this." She started with the tools, her ledger, the calipers, the small roll of ironworking notes she'd been adding to since she arrived, and measurements and load tolerances for the barn's east wall, calculations she hadn't finished yet because she thought she had more time. She had always thought she had more time, and she had always been wrong. The light was still thin. Early, the sun not yet over the ridge, and the cabin was cold in the way it got before the stove was lit, a cold that sat in the floor and worked upward. Her dark jade skin registered it the way it registered everything, as information, not complaint. She was aware of her own hands, the warmth still in them from the blankets, the way the cold was already finding the old breaks in her right fingers and settling there like it owned the place. She heard Cale's boots on the porch. He came in the way he always came in, without announcement, without noise beyond what the door required, and stopped when he saw the trunk open on the floor. He looked at it. He looked at her. He did not say anything for a moment, and she did not stop packing. "Letter," she said. He waited. My mother is ill," Dav wrote. She set the ledger in the trunk. "The clan wants me back." Cale crossed to the stove and began building the fire. She watched him from the corner of her eye, the careful way he handled the kindling with his right hand wrap, the tendon damaged one, the wrapping already done before he came inside, which meant he'd done it in the dark of the barn the way he always did, the private management of a private thing. He did not look at the trunk again. "If you go," he said, "the contract dispute goes with Sen by default." She knew that. She had already run the calculation. Sen's renewal clause required her presence to contest. Without her, there was no mutual party. Without a mutual party, the clause stood. Cale lost the renegotiation. She lost whatever this was. "I know," she said. He got the fire going, set the kettle on. Then he said, without turning around, "That's not why I'm saying it." She stopped. Her hands were still on the edge of the trunk, the iron-working notes half-placed, and she stopped and looked at the back of his head and thought about what it cost a man like Cale Dunmore to say a sentence like that. He didn't offer things he didn't mean. She had learned that about him the way she'd learned everything about him, by watching what he did when he thought no one was keeping score. She sat down on the edge of the trunk. She picked up Dav's letter again. She read it a fourth time. And this time she read it the way she read contracts, not for what it said, but for the structure underneath what it said, the word choices, the rhythm of the sentences. Dav wrote short when he was being honest. He wrote long when he was being careful. This letter was long. And there, in the third paragraph, in the framing of the request, in the specific phrase, "You are the one who can survive the journey back," there was her mother. Not Dav's words. Her mother's logic, wearing Dav's handwriting like a coat. You are the one who can survive it. The same construction, the same calculation, the same arithmetic that had put her on a mountain in the first place. Her mother's arithmetic, in which Vara was always the variable that could be moved, because Vara was the one who could take it, because Vara had always taken it, because Vara had never once made her mother believe otherwise. She sat with that for a long time. The fire caught. The kettle began its slow work. Outside, the first snow of the season was coming down off the ridge. She could see it through the window. Not heavy yet. Just the mountain's first serious statement of intent. The kind of snow that said, "I am not finished with you." Cale put a cup of coffee on the floor beside her. Not on the table. On the floor, where she was sitting, so she didn't have to reach. He didn't say anything. He went back to the stove and started on breakfast and left her the silence the way you leave someone. A room. Deliberately, with the door open. She looked at the cup. She looked at the letter. Temporary is all I've ever had, she thought. And then, for the first time, the second half of it arrived without warning. But whose choice was that? Not a rhetorical question. An actual one. She turned it over. Her mother's choice, Sen's choice, her own choice, made so many times it had started to feel like nature. Leave before it ends. Pack before you're asked to leave. Make nothing permanent so nothing can be taken. Whose choice? She looked at the trunk, the ledger inside it, the unfinished calculations for the barn's east wall. She looked at the window, at the snow coming down. She reached out and closed the trunk. Not unpacked, not decided, just closed. She picked up the coffee and drank it while it was still warm, and the snow kept coming. And behind her, Carl made breakfast for 2 people without being asked to, without making anything of it. The same way he'd been doing it for 6 weeks. as if it had always been this way, as if the second plate had always had someone sitting behind it. She did not unpack the trunk. She did not take it back to the door either. She just sat with the closed trunk under her and the warm cup in her hands and watched the mountain commit itself to winter. And she was still here. And she let that be enough for now. The magistrate's office in Dunwich Ford smelled like tallow candles and old paper and the particular damp of a building that had been sealed against October for too long. Vara stood at the clerk's counter with the 2 contract copies laid flat and her ledger open beside them, and spoke in the numbered sequence she had prepared on the ride down. Point 1. The mutual clause language in the original filing. Point 2. The absence of that language in Sen's summary copy. Point 3. The material difference between the 2 documents and what that difference meant under settlement contract law. She did not raise her voice. She did not look at Sen, who was standing to her left with his hat in his hands and his pleasant expression still in place. She looked at the magistrate and gave him the argument in the order that made it easiest to follow, the way you'd lay out a load calculation for someone who needed to understand why the beam would fail. The magistrate was a small man with ink-stained fingers and the look of someone who had been doing this long enough to be tired of people wasting his time. He read the mutual clause. He read Sen's version. He looked up. This word is missing, he said. Yes, Vara said. He voided the renewal option in 4 sentences and stamped the original with a seal that made a sound like a period at the end of a very long argument. Sen, to his credit, did not perform. He looked at the stamped document for a moment, then at Vara, and something moved behind his eyes that was not quite respect and not quite its opposite, more like the recalibration of a man who had misjudged the weight of a thing and was adjusting his estimates for next time. He tipped his hat, he picked up his copy, he walked out and the door swung shut behind him, and that was the end of it, not triumph. That was the thing Vara noticed standing there with the stamped original in her hands. Not triumph, something quieter and more specific, the relief of a threat that ends on paper instead of in the body. She had known the other kind. This was better. Cale was waiting outside with the horses. He had not come in. She had not asked him to stay out, but he had read it correctly, that she needed to stand in that room as herself, not as someone's arrangement. And he had taken the horses to the trough and waited, and when she came through the door, he looked at her face and then at the document in her hand and said nothing, which was the right amount. They rode back up the mountain in the thin afternoon light, the trail switching back through the aspens, most of the gold gone now, the branches bare and pale against the grey sky. The first real cold had come down while they were in town. Vara could feel it through her coat, and the skin on the backs of her hands had gone darker in the chill, the deep jade pulling toward black the way it did when the temperature dropped. She flexed her right hand around the reins. The crooked fingers held. Cale asked her what she wanted the winter to look like. She had not expected the question. She turned it over for a moment before answering. The trap line work, she said. She could help with the load calculations for the pelt yield. She'd been running the numbers already. The barn's north wall needed a proper iron brace before January or the snow load would take it. She wanted to finish the smokehouse door hardware. The hinge she'd fitted was good, but the latch pin was wrong gauged and she'd known it when she put it in and had not had the right stock. He listened. He asked one question about the barn wall, angle of the brace or weight distribution. And she told him, and he nodded, and they rode for a while without talking, which was not uncomfortable. Then he asked if the smithing was something she wanted to do, or something she had been doing because she had to. She thought about that longer than the other questions. The forge work, the structural calculations, the feeling of a brace cooling under her hands, and knowing it would hold through February and March and the weight of whatever the mountain put on it. She had not separated want from have to in a long time. The two had been the same for most of her adult life. She had done what was needed because What was needed was also what she was good at, and being good at something had been the only leverage she'd had. "It's both," she said. "But the wanting part is bigger than it used to be." He nodded, that was all. But she had learned by now that his nods were not dismissals. They were the sound of something being filed. They reached the homestead as the light was going. The snow that had started the night before had settled into something committed. Not a storm, just the mountain making its intentions clear, the white coming down steady and quiet through the pines. Vara put the horses up while Cale went inside, and she stood in the barn for a moment in the smell of hay and cold iron, and listened to the snow and thought about the word temporary, and waited for it to feel true the way it always had. It didn't. She let herself notice that. She did not make anything of it yet. She just held it. Inside, Cale had set the table. Both plates, no pause between them. She could tell by the way they sat, easy and even, that there had been no hesitation in the placing of them. Not habit, not grief, just 2 plates for 2 people who lived here. She had watched him set the table enough times to know the difference, and the difference was there, and she did not say anything about it, because she did not need to. After supper, he took the voided contract from her side of the table, folded it once, and put it in the fire. Not dramatically, tidily, the way you dispose of something that had served its purpose, and was now just paper. Then he went to the shelf where he kept the writing things, and came back with a blank sheet and set it in front of her. "If you want to write something to Dav," he said, "I'll write it down to Nessa's in the morning." She looked at him. He meant it the way he meant everything, without performance, without explanation, without requiring her to account for why she might want the thing he was offering. Just, "Here is a thing you might need. Here it is." Well, she had not known a person could do that. Just hand something back. She sat with it for a moment. The blank paper, the offer, the specific quality of what it meant that he had thought of it at all, that he had understood without being told that the letter from her mother had closed a door she needed to open herself, on her own terms, in her own words. She picked up the pen. She wrote to Dav. Her sentences, her handwriting. No one else's logic threaded through it. She told him she was on the mountain. She told him the work was good. She told him she would write again in the spring, and that if he wanted to write back, he could send it through Nessa Calvert at Dunwick's Ford, and that she was well, and that she meant it. She set the letter beside the second plate and looked at it for a moment. Outside, the snow was coming down in earnest, and the mountain fully committed now, the pines dark against the white, and the ridge invisible above the cloud. Inside the cabin the fire was going and the plates were cleared and the letter was written and the threat was stamped and filed and burned. She had said it to herself so many times it had become the shape of her thinking. "Temporary is all I've ever had." She said it now, quietly, standing at the window with the snow coming down, and waited. The words sat in her mouth and did not fit what she was standing in. She knew the difference. She had always known the difference. She had just never been in a position to use the knowledge. She let the phrase go, not dramatically, tidily, the way you'd set down something you'd been carrying longer than you needed to. The snow came down. The fire held. She stayed.